It's a crazy new meta out there. Let's go break it. Here are 8 decks from myself and others that have been succeeding at high infinite in the first day of this all new meta. Let's start with Ajax Midrange. I have been a huge proponent of Ajax, far more so than I think most other content creators have, and that is because I really value his ability to succeed within the confines of only really needing 2 cards to get maximum value out of him, himself and Hazmat. Now, when you are an Ajax deck, that's really kind of a misnomer. You're not necessarily an Ajax deck, you're a deck that can fit Ajax and Hazmat in profitably. People playing Man-Thing and US Agent, I think that's just sort of the wrong direction to go. Now, this was a list that I was playing before the changes. I previously had Mysterio and Mockingbird in instead of Sage and Juggernaut. So I know you're going to ask, what is it that caused me to take those cards out, and why have I chosen the replacements that I have? For me, I think the main thing here that for why I like these replacements is they are surprising and very, very large, and losing Mysterio Mockingbird loses us a lot of our beef, a lot of our final turn ba-boom booms. So I want to have that kind of effect in the deck. Both Juggernaut and Sage are effectively the just big, monstrous lane winners, and I think that's really what I'm trying to get across here. We have like these final turn, like Hazmat, Kitty Pryde, and then one of our amazing 3-drops. That's a really powerful thing to do. I found a ton of value in Juggernaut, and I'm assuming that by making this video, that value will decrease. This was by far my most successful deck. I tested a lot of these decks on ladder to varying results. This one, by far the best of anything I've played so far in this new metagame. It is extremely, extremely strong. However, I don't want to sit here and tell you you have to buy Ajax for it, because you can play this shell, go a bit of a different direct route with it, and still have some success. So let's check that version out too. Here we have No Jax, and what you'll notice is that these decks responded to the nerf to Mysterio, to the nerf to Mockingbird, and specifically her ability to work with Mysterio in sort of different ways. When a card like Mockingbird is nerfed in the way that it is, gaining an extra cost and an extra power, more vulnerability to Shang-Chi, of course, when it is done that way, what you need to ask yourself is this small package of Mysterio Mockingbird still worth running? If not, what am I replacing it with? That's what the first deck we showed was. Secondarily, the other direction you can go with it is this small package still worth running? What happens if I invest further into it? And that is what Gwenpool and Sasquatch are doing here. They're saying, look, I'm investing even more in being a Mysterio deck. I have more Mysterio payoffs, because maybe it's not worth it to just run Mysterio Mockingbird anymore now that she's not getting all that much cheaper, but it can easily be worth it to run Mysterio Gwenpool or to run Mysterio Sasquatch. So I have all of these additional payoffs for having Mysterio in the deck, as opposed to just being a one-off thing. Now, there is one card that I really want to highlight that is, in my opinion, incredibly important to both of these decks, and that is Shang-Chi. Shang-Chi has probably never been better in the history of Marvel Snap than he is right now. There is so much that goes into creating large units in this game. There have never been more targets for Shang-Chi in the metagame than there are right now. He is an absolute monster, an absolute powerhouse, and one of the things that the Mockingbird nerf does is allow you to fit him into the deck. Previous iterations of these kind of decks were very hard forcing Darkhawk stuff into it, and when you have this amount of power in the deck, whether that be because Ajax is just big enough to beat a blob some of the time, which is real, or because you're playing a bunch of big stuff on the final turn, like Mockingbird and Sasquatch, which is real, you end up actually being able to contest these Arishem decks on numbers without forcing the Darkhawk into it. When Darkhawk was a big major factor, it was in shells like this that were using Hope Summers in order to be able to play Darkhawk Mystique on the final turn of the game. But once the Arishem decks adapted with cards like Echo, with cards like Goliath, it ended up just being not really worth investing in, and you had to say, all right, look, I am just going to try to beat them on points with value. And additionally, the one thing you're going to really want to look out for when playing either of these decks against an Arishem deck is the card Leech. You're pretty damn good against the card Dr. Octopus. They have 2 really busted 5-drops they like playing on 4. you're pretty good against the card Dr. Octopus. With this build with the Mobius in there, you're pretty good against Loki too, just as a side note there. Dr. Octopus you're good against because you have a Jeff, you have a Nocturne, you have a Kitty Pryde. You can set up situations where there is no lane that they can profitably Dr. Octopus without having something being able to move out of that lane. That's a very important thing to do. You have a Shang-Chi. As we all know, Doc always pulls Shang-Chi, or so it seems. A lot of good things going for this deck in the face of Dr. Octopus. However, both these decks, notable vulnerability to Leech because they do care a lot about Shang-Chi. One of the things that I will say is I do think that this deck is a little bit less vulnerable to Leech and a little bit more vulnerable to Dr. Octopus. I realize that sort of might be a little bit confusing, but the other deck has Juggernaut and Sage and Hazmat as excellent targets for Leech. This deck uses Mysterio, so it ends up being a little bit more clogged on its own, and that can make it a little bit worse into Dr. Octopus and other clogged things of that nature, but better into Leech because it's not relying on that stuff as much. So it's sort of like that's kind of the dynamic between these two decks as I see it into the Arishem matchup right now. Next up is Thanos Jaw. This is Zombies Go Nom Noms build. I was fairly impressed with it, but generally felt as though Lockjaw did not do exactly enough in a metagame like this for me to be super happy with it. I would expect that you see a lot of things like this. One note here is it's entirely possible to swap out Black Swan for Blob or something. I actually kind of liked the Black Swan. I doubt she's going to end up being like a key part of these decks, but being able to have Black Swan on 3 into Lockjaw on 4 and some stones into there was pretty meaningful. I will say that playing this deck, it really did feel like Mind Stone costing 2 was very bad. And also that it did seem possible that if they wanted to bring Thanos back into the metagame, they could make Mind Stone cost 1 again, and it wouldn't be too out of line with what Arishem decks are doing, with what Thena decks are doing, with what Ajax decks are doing. I think it would be probably okay to do, and it is something that's sort of sitting in the back of my mind when I play a deck like this, because on the whole, it was okay. It wasn't that bad. It was cool, and it got to do unique and interesting stuff, but I don't think that it did enough. I think that generally speaking, the ways in which this deck matches up into the metagame, it's like almost good enough to take down Arishem, almost good enough to take down Thena, but it ends up being like 45% into their 55%, and that is just not a situation you want to be in very often. It's also very draw dependent still, because that Thanos starts in your opening hand, and there's this weird tension between, do I play the stones out early so I can start cycling through my deck, or how much of them am I supposed to be saving for Lockjaw here? It feels like an imperfect marriage. I enjoyed playing the deck. I think you'll see people playing the deck, but this feels like something that could use a buff or maybe a little bit more love put into figuring out what the shell is supposed to be. It is a very good Mockingbird deck, and that makes it a very good Scar deck as well, although I will say I basically never got a zero-cost Scar, whether that be because of Mobius or just I never got enough big guys on the board. It does seem to go that way a decent amount of the time. Next up is Jane Jaw, an archetype that has been legitimately powerful in the past. When I played this deck, it felt very iffy to me. This is a list I pulled off of Untapped. I don't know who made it. One note that I would have is I did not get a lot of value out of the Psylocke. I get what it's doing. You're trying to accelerate your Lockjaw out, but it ends up making your Lockjaw conflict with your Thor a little bit. I'm not sure what that card needs to be, but I do think there is likely going to be a better option than Psylocke in that spot. This is a deck that is built for explosive power, but the issue it has is I'm not fully convinced it's better to play in this shell than, say, Pixie Mobius would be, right? It has sort of the same upsides and same downsides, this potential explosion, but this is a little bit harder to make the curve work in because of how pricey a lot of your top-end stuff is. If you're missing a 3-drop, you're often not playing anything until turn 4, and that is super possible because you only run 2 3-drops, and it's not really all that good to play a Psylocke on 2 if you don't have a 4 to go into. Like, I get what's trying to happen here, and I think it's a reasonably interesting thing to do, but I do think that this shell is going to need a little bit more love before it gets to a point where I feel legitimately confident in it. The power is there. Your nut draw is strong, but I am not overly convinced that, say, running a Blink wouldn't just be better than running Lockjaw here, because you're so often not nut drawing, right? Like, this is a deck that's very clunky right now, and it might just be better to run something that is more consistently good as opposed to something that is just like the high roll is extremely high, but the payoff is only there when you high roll. And this is a deck that also, you really feel it when you draw badly, right? You have these games where your hand is unplayable, and then because you're a Lockjaw deck, your Lockjaw is unplayable, because when your hand is unplayable, it's because you got all the expensive stuff in hand, which means there's nothing good for the Lockjaw to get out of your deck. So now the Lockjaw is just like pulling like Psylocks and Wasps and Thor, and it's like, oh man, the bad draws with this deck are really, really meaningful. Like, you really feel it. The delta between a good draw and a bad draw is really high, and the power of your, like, kind of good draws, where you're like, okay, I am fulfilling my game plan, you kind of want to snap them, but they're not exactly strong enough to, like, guarantee to beat an Arishem or anything like that. I wouldn't be shocked if the best build of Thors still ended up being that effective Sarah-less Sarah one, where you're just playing Sarah, well, not actually Sarah, you're just playing the Sarah game plan with just like Thor, Bill, Jane, and then tech cards on the final turn alongside your hammers. That would not shock me if it ended up being the best way to build this deck. It would not shock me if this was playable, but not the best way to build the deck. So here's where I'm at with Arishem. I think this is where I take my official L on Quinjet. This is the list that most recently hit rank 1 in the hands of a Chinese player whose name I cannot fully pronounce, but I believe the English translation is Young Nunu. Huge shout out to Young Nunu. They're actually like a super OG who's been around for a while. You can sometimes catch them in Twitch chat, so shout out Young Nunu. And of course, we have the typical build at this point, very heavy. The emphasis here is on Loki, is on Doc Ock, is on Leech, and then when you get into the end game, your emphasis is on, I'm just going to do something generally unfair. But those 3 cards are carrying a lot of weight for this deck right now because of what you're able to do when you accelerate into them. I think that there is something worth talking about in the context of ramp isn't always the same. The value of ramping something out isn't always the same. When I look at cards like Old Professor X, like Dr. Octopus, like Leech, I see a card that was designed for a game that doesn't exist anymore. These are cards that were designed in the base set of Marvel Snap when there wasn't a really good way to accelerate your energy. You had to be like playing things like Electro, making real sacrifices in order to play a Dr. Octopus on turn 4 or a Leech on turn 4. Arishem allows you to just do that. No sacrifices, nothing. I mean, you know, you get the sacrifice of like putting random cards in your deck, but it's become clear over this point that that is a much less meaningful sacrifice than being an Electro deck, because A, your energy is guaranteed, and B, you're not playing Electro. Both huge upsides, right? And so you end up in a situation where these cards that were clearly designed mentally, like the people who made them almost certainly made them with the thought of, these are cards that are meant to be played on the second to final turn of the game, the penultimate turn of the game. And they are designed to have an impact that is meant for that penultimate turn, meaning Dr. Octopus. You're not supposed to have 2 turns to clean up after Dr. Octopus. It's meant to be different, but that's how it is right now. Whether that be via magic in clog decks or just by Arishem existing, we now have 2 turns to clean up after Dr. Octopus, and that is plenty of time to do that. And that means that this sort of theoretical downside that these cards have is totally negated by Arishem's existence. And I think a lot of the power of this deck, maybe like a significant portion, is wrapped up in Leech and Dr. Octopus right now. And I think we should all be thanking our lucky stars that Professor X got nerfed, because if it wasn't for that, a lot of the power would be wrapped up in that card. That would be absolutely incredibly miserable for a deck that starts with extra energy to be able to turn 4 Profex after playing a turn 3 4-drop. That sounds super miserable. Thank God they got rid of that. But this is like their sort of like annoying stepbrothers, right? These are worse than Professor X would have been in terms of actually being good, but they are fulfilling a similar role, albeit in a worse way. This is Yo Woody's build of Annie Sersi. I found it to be like fairly fun and enjoyable. One of the things that's becoming clearer is as the Arishem decks sort of mature, they become much more about Leech and Dr. Octopus, which drags their overall point output a little bit further down. Like, they're still putting out a decent amount of points, but it's not like it was in the early days where their whole thing was like, I'm playing 3 blobs, what's up? And so that means that smaller mid-range decks that were dealing with those issues, that were unable to meaningfully deal with those issues because they're not decks that play Shang-Chi, were able to sort of slide back into the metagame. And this is one of them. This is a like Clog sub-theme, Sersi sub-theme deck that is built to do some damage when it can. It's a powerful, reasonable, interesting deck. And I think there's got a lot going for it in terms of just being a good deck that you can play, and it doesn't require too much of you. It's one of the decks that's really doing an interesting thing with New Mockingbird to me, which is saying, I want more than just Mysterio for this. I would like to be more than just a Mysterio Mockingbird deck. I also have Sersi to discount it. I have the Demon to discount it. And I think that there is something to, will this deck reward me for investing further in Mockingbird compared to other Mockingbird decks? That is a reasonable question to ask, and I think it's still yet to be answered, unfortunately. But this is an exciting, interesting, classic take on mid-range. One thing I'm interested to see in here is just how everyone sort of bounces off of Viper, because there's some really interesting stuff you can do with this card, but it sort of conflicts with both Sersi and Mockingbird a little bit, right? Because if you're sending over a Mysterio, that is one thing that your Sersi is now no longer going to evolve. It is one thing that your Mockingbird is now no longer going to get a discount on. If you're sending over something like a Hood, well, I mean, you were going to do that with a Nihilus anyway, maybe. There's some stuff going on here where there's a little bit of tension between the Viper and the other stuff. A card I was trying to get in here was Debris. I can't exactly figure out how I would do that, but I am interested in doing that. And of course, the tech slot, because we are mostly unable to get a Shang-Chi in here, but we can do final turn Mockingbird and Shadow King. Shadow King, of course, excellent against the card the Blob, who is going to go all the way down to 0 when SK'd. Another deck that looks to leverage New Mockingbird in a way that was not previously possible is the classic Deathbird deck. This build comes from Gnome Plays, who I will not pretend is actually named Gnome Stays. This is a deck that is trying to leverage Mockingbird in order to discount Scar. It's a very straightforward thing here. We leverage Mockingbird to discount Scar. We leverage Killmonger and Squirrel Girl to discount Death. We have a Carnage in here to discount Death as well. If they're playing 1-drops, we're really in business. And I think that's sort of where, if anywhere this deck falls short, that is where. Because this is a deck that is good into a metagame of like Zoo and Nihilus stuff. And right now, we are not in a metagame where that is really happening. A lot of the best decks are decks like Arishem or decks like Thena decks, where your opponent is not really invested in either A, sending stuff over to your side, or B, playing a bunch of 1-drops. And when they are, this deck is well positioned, but when they aren't, Death ends up being like, you know, you can do it, but it doesn't end up being as good as some of the potential alternatives. It's a strong, powerful deck that did actually take this nerf to Mockingbird and turn it into an upside, because it is a Squirrel Girl Mysterio deck. You are able to discount it massively. You can get the Mockingbird down, then Killmonger all your stuff. That's really cool because it gives you the Scar discount and all of that. You try to overload your opponent's Shang-Chi, so there's just like big dudes in every lane. They can't really do anything about that. Again, it is a cool, interesting, powerful deck. It runs into some issues with, I mean, like Juggernaut, for example, really hard for this card to deal with, this deck to deal with. It is a bit just sort of straightforward, right? Your opponent is almost always going to know what your potential output range is, and your potential output range is very typically 2 or 3 giant things on the final turn of the game. So whatever the game state is on 5, it's that plus maybe a Death and a Scar, plus maybe whatever that is. You don't really do other stuff a lot of the time. You also do see the Shadow King included in here. Shadow King is the tech choice here. You could also, if you're seeing a lot of Mobius, run Rogue, something of that nature. I think that Shadow King makes a lot of sense because a decent amount of the time, maybe our Scar only gets discounted to 4 or something like that. Or maybe we have a 2-cost Mockingbird, a 2-cost Scar, and a Shadow King. All that stuff seems fairly appealing to me. The cheaper option, Shadow King, being great into Blob, does matter as well. Another cook from Gnome. This is Wolfjax, as I'm calling it, a bounce deck that is kind of a bounce deck, kind of a clog deck, kind of a werewolf deck, and kind of an Ajax deck. There's just a lot of unique power in a deck like this. You can do a lot of different things, and the numbers this deck puts on the board are very high. You are fairly low on reasonable interaction, though. You're leaning a lot on Red Guardian to deal with just like whatever weird stuff you have. We don't necessarily have a Shang-Chi in here. I would be interested in trying Shang-Chi for Red Guardian. We have Werewolf, who can get very, very large. Obviously, a Bounce Werewolf Shell is extremely powerful. There's a lot going for this deck, but there's also some markers against it. Things like the preponderance of other decks to have Shang and Shadow King. Things like the fact that your power is going to be so much, not necessarily telegraphed, it's kind of the opposite of telegraphed, but this deck puts you in a lot of read situations where you and your opponent both look at the turn 6 board and your options are so vast, right? You have so many different lanes you could choose to target, and it's very much like, okay, what does my opponent think I'm going to do, and how do I beat the thing they think I'm going to do? It's a lot of heavy power allocation. There's not a lot of really guaranteed wins in a deck like this because of how few of the cards that give us guaranteed wins we actually run, right? Like, Shang-Chi's a card that can give you a guaranteed win. We don't have that, right? Shadow King can guaranteed beat a blob. We don't have that. We have a lot of power allocation and movement. We have big rocket raccoons. We have big werewolves. We have big Ajax, right? There's a bunch of stuff we have, but it's all just meeting our opponent on equal terms and saying power to power. Let's go. We're both putting power on the board. And so that can be a little bit risky if you are not fully outclassing your opponent. And there are decks that this deck fully outclasses, where it just, you have so many numbers that you can't actually compete. But I think it'll have a harder time with the more consistent Arishem decks, the more consistent decks with Thina in them, right? Like, it's kind of, it's good, but it'll definitely put you in a lot of read and react type situations where you'll have to get a sense for what your opponent expects and how you can guaranteed win that game. And a lot of the time it is just going to be, I'm investing here, I hope they don't invest here. Where your opponent can choose to like reinforce a lane that you're targeting and you can lose to that, right? A lot of sort of if they, will they, won't they situations with a deck like this. All right, y'all, I hope you enjoyed that look. I hope people like these videos. I really want to start doing more like day one metagame reactions, but it's rare that I get enough time to stream on those days. Like, normally I get like a little 4-hour stream. I got like 6 in, and so I feel like I can actually talk about this stuff with some degree of familiarity. For me, I do think that like the Thina shells are really good, the Arishem shells are really good, and a lot of the rest of this stuff is stuff that I really want to see people experiment with and work on. But if you're just watching this video looking for what my day one take on what I think the best deck in the game is, it's going to be one of the Thina decks, it's going to be one of the Arishem decks. Pick one and run with it. I think both of those felt extremely powerful to me, and I would expect both of those to make it at least to my tier list in a couple days, for sure. So as always, I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I will see you in the next one. And I did want to let y'all know, I am getting shorts out there again. I'm starting doing some more YouTube shorts, going to rev up the old TikTok just in time for it to get banned, I think. I don't actually know if that's still happening, but maybe. Anyway, please do check me out. I'm going to be getting those YouTube shorts going probably like 4 or 5 a week, hopefully. And of course, over on TikTok as well, so you can get the best highlights from my games. I really hope you enjoy that. I'll have a link to the TikTok in the description, of course. And thank you so much. I've been KM Best. You have been phenomenal. I'll see you in the next one.